I'm not sure if you have noticed, but it seems like every ad on television these days is about sports betting. Recently, one of our members shared with me an ad from Caesars Sportsbook. In it, the black comedian J.B. Smoove is dressed as Caesar, with his arms open like this, screaming in victory. And the quote above his head states, "We are all Caesars. We are all Caesars." Before I deconstruct the theology of that statement, you should know that the same church member who sent me this ad insightfully told me, you can read that phrase in two different ways. On the one hand, "we are all Caesars" can mean we're all kings. We're all emperors. We're all queens. We're all royalty. We are all lords and ladies of our own castle. On the other hand, "we are all Caesars" can mean we are Caesar's children, Caesar's offspring, Caesar's custody. We belong to Caesar. It can mean we are owned by Caesar. We are Caesar's possession. All it takes is an apostrophe for the ad to say, "We are all Caesar's property." So the question for us is, are we all little Caesars? No, I'm not talking about the pizza. Some of you are hungry for that. I know. Are we all little Caesars? Or are we all Caesars with an apostrophe? Are we royalty or are we property? Are we the owners or the owned? Are we the possessors or the possessions? Are we the custodians or are we the custody? This is not a simple question with a simple answer, because we are people living in the American empire in the 21st century. And that means that there are many ways in which we find ourselves possessed by Caesar without even realizing it. American culture seeks to convince us that instead of one person being Caesar, we all get to be Caesars. But this is nothing more than a mask for the tyranny of individualism, which obscures the fact that there are true Caesars who have us under their thumbs and seek to have dominion over our hearts and minds and bodies. Convincing us that we're all Caesars is the perfect trick to blind us from the fact that in reality, we are all Caesars with an apostrophe S. Things were much clearer in Judah in the first century. The Roman Empire was not trying to trick anyone into believing that they were Caesar. Instead, they made it abundantly clear to the entire world that there was only one Caesar, and that was Augustus, the emperor of Rome. When the Roman army would conquer a region, they would subjugate the people by requiring them to render what was called a tribute, a special imperial tax. Levying tribute was one of the primary reasons for imperial conquest in the first place, the principal way that Rome became a wealthy empire. When the coffers were running low, they would conquer another region of the world and require the people living there to pay a tribute. In Judea, when the Romans came and conquered, the people were already paying taxes to fund Herod's grandiose building projects, as well as tithes and offerings to the temple. And now, on top of all that, all the residents of Judea were now required to pay a tribute of 25% of all they produced to their Roman imperial rulers once a year. And you thought our taxes were high. Adding insult to injury, the Roman tribute could not be paid in ordinary currency, such as a Jewish shekel or a Greek drachma, which were traditionally used. No, it had to be paid with a Roman denarius, which required an exchange fee on top of the tax itself. As you can imagine, for the average Jewish person who was already heavily taxed and deeply indebted and living hand to mouth by subsistence farming, the Roman tribute was extremely controversial and widely despised. Yet to make matters worse, the tribute was also an affront to Jewish faith. Every denarius had the image of Caesar on it, and the inscription, Caesar Augustus, son of the divine Augustus. So the coin contained a graven image and a declaration that Caesar was God. Therefore, most Jews living at the time of Jesus believed that to even hold a denarius in one's possession, let alone pay the tribute, was a direct violation of the first two commandments. You shall have no other gods before me, and you shall make for yourself no idol from anything in heaven or on earth, and you shall not bow down and worship them. The problem, though, was that Romans viewed any refusal to pay the tribute as tantamount to an insurrection, and they would come swiftly to crucify anyone who resisted taxation. So most people in occupied Judea simply held their noses and paid the tax. Around the time Jesus was born, a Galilean named Judas and a Pharisee named Zadok started a movement, a new Jewish movement called the Fourth Philosophy, that went beyond the three primary Jewish sects of the time, the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes. They were the fourth. According to historian Josephus, the Fourth Philosophy agreed with the views of the Pharisees in everything except they had an unconquerable passion for freedom, since they took God as their only leader and master. Judas the Galilean and Zadok the Pharisee protested the census of Quirinius, that is the backdrop of the Christmas story, because they knew that a Roman tribute would follow and be imposed on them. And they believed that Roman tribute, any kind of tribute, amounted to a form of slavery. They opposed this kind of direct rule over Judea, and they reproached all their fellow Jews not to pay taxes, this particular tax, the tribute to the Romans. Now, we don't know what eventually happened to Judas or Zadok, but we know that their teaching led to the widespread belief in liberation among young people in Judea and evolved into a group called the Zealots. This group, Josephus blames the Fourth Philosophy for poisoning the minds of the youth in Judea, leading to all-out war with Rome and eventually causing the destruction of the temple. Now, just like Judas, Jesus was also from Galilee, which means he grew up with the Fourth Philosophy all around him as a child, and the authorities would have assumed that he was a part of the movement even if he was not. In the beginning, the Pharisees attempted to question Jesus, but their efforts to undermine his teaching failed at every turn. And so when Jesus arrived in Jerusalem for the Passover, they knew the stakes were high. Freedom and liberation would be on the hearts and minds of every Jewish person living in the city. So in an act of desperation, the Pharisees decided to change their tactics, and they moved from questioning Jesus to trying to trap him. And our story today is the first of three traps they laid for Jesus. And for this particular trap, they conspired with some Herodians, officials from King Herod's court, to amplify the potential consequences if Jesus stumbled and fell into their trap. Jesus had just turned over the tables of the money changers and condemned the temple and the high priests. They knew his direct confrontation with them was also an indirect attack on the Roman imperial order in Palestine. And so they tried to come up with a way to get Jesus to express his resistance to the empire publicly and explicitly once and for all by teaching people not to pay the controversial tribute to Rome. The Pharisees' trap was diabolical. They called Jesus Rabbi, teacher, even though we all know they did not believe in his teachings or think him a rabbi. Then they tried to disarm him with vain flattery, saying, "We know you are sincere. We know you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. and that you show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality. It was a setup. You can almost hear Jesus thinking to himself, boy, it's getting deep in here. But then they suddenly brought down the hammer. Is it lawful, teach us, is it lawful to pay taxes, the tribute to the emperor or not? If Jesus said no, they would have had him arrested on the spot for treason against the empire. He would be branded a rebel, tried as an insurrectionist, and crucified by the end of the day. If he had said yes, he'd lose his followers who were serious about the law and the prophets. He'd lose those followers hoping for freedom and liberation from imperial subjugation who did not believe in paying the tribute. Not to mention, it's obvious that Jesus himself did not believe in paying this particular tax, the tribute. So if he said yes, he'd also be lying and would have betrayed his own integrity. So it was the perfect trap. One of the greatest catch-22s of all time, a no-win situation. This week, as we witnessed the horrific violence in the Middle East, many of us found ourselves in a similar situation. I found myself in that situation. The brutal surprise attack by Hamas that murdered 1,300 Israeli civilians, injured thousands more, and the kidnapping of 150 hostages left us shocked, shaken, enraged. It was especially traumatic for our Jewish neighbors in Israel and here in America, friends and rabbis of colleagues of mine that I reached out to, Jews all over the world as people who have been the victims of oppression and violence and genocide for thousands and thousands of years. Many of us, many people in society, quickly jumped to condemn the atrocities of Hamas and set out heartfelt support for the Israelis. But then Israel's swift and brutal response, cutting off power and water, engaging on a full-on bombardment of Gaza, killing 2,000 people, threatening a ground siege, forcing the mass evacuation of 1.1 million Palestinians, also left us shocked, shaken, enraged. A stark demonstration of the massive power differential between occupier and occupied, as well as a powerful reminder of the history of a 100-year-old conflict that we as Americans must admit we share the burden of responsibility for creating. Like so many of my friends and colleagues, I found myself feeling convicted. I found myself trapped, unable to speak, not knowing what to say. I, personally, believe the Jewish people have a right to a homeland of safety and security, but I do not consider myself a Zionist. I believe the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination and a homeland of their own, of safety and security as well, but I do not support Hamas or any other violent military group. However, we all discovered this week that if you condemn Hamas and support Israel, you will be quickly labeled Islamophobic and accused of not understanding the Palestinian people's 100-year-long fight for liberation. On the other hand, if you condemn Israel and support Palestine, you will be quickly labeled anti-Semitic and accused of not understanding the Jewish people's 100-year fight for safety. It felt like a catch-22. There was nowhere to turn. Look how many different activist groups, especially student groups on college campuses, stumbled into the trap. Either condemning Israel's violence and not Hamas's, or condemning Hamas's violence but not Israel's. We were all left wondering, asking, how do we stand with Israel without being Zionist or Islamophobic? How do we stand with Palestine without being anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic? It was a trap. I was asked by an organization to help them draft a statement, and I feared I was at a loss about what to say. I wasn't sure I was going to come up with anything helpful. After praying for discernment, what came to me, not from myself, it came from somewhere, was that this is not the time to rehearse the history of this conflict, to nurse old wounds, to to share our perspectives about the state of Israel, to argue about who has a right to the land, to pontificate about the ethics of the American government's unwavering support for occupation and apartheid, or to theoretically discuss the possibilities of a two-state solution. The time for those things will come later. Instead, what came to me, what I shared with them, is that the first and foremost thing for us to do in the wake of extreme violence is to grieve. Stop and grieve. Stop and mourn the tragic loss of life, both Israeli and Palestinian, both Jewish and Muslim and Christian and non-religious. All the lives lost. Grief must always come first. And if there appears to be some limits on our grief, we have to take the time to honestly interrogate why we can only grieve the loss of some lives and not others. Second, I thought, everyone wants a condemnation. Condemn something. Condemn this group. Condemn that group. If we must condemn something, let us condemn all violence. Let us condemn all violence. Especially, let us condemn all violence against innocent civilians, children, teenagers. No matter who has committed that war crime, regardless of whether it is provocative or reactionary, it doesn't matter, it's wrong. And then and only then, I thought, once we've grieved, once we've condemned violence, then we can offer our prayers for the people of Israel and Palestine, for Jews and Muslims, to show our solidarity with everyone around the world who is grieving, and to begin to engage in the work of peace. As people of faith, we have to remember in these times of war, we can always express grief over the loss of life. We can always, if we follow Jesus, condemn violence against innocent civilians. And we can always offer our prayers, show our solidarity, and begin to work together for peace. An elder of mine reminded me this week of the Buddhist text from the Vilamala Kirti, a sutra where the Buddha says, "In times of war, one should give rise in yourself to the mind of compassion and help all living beings abandon the will to fight." In times of war, we should give rise in ourselves to the mind of compassion and help all living beings abandon the will to fight. Horrific violence and war does not simply threaten the lives and souls of people on the ground in the Middle East. It also threatens the lives and souls of every human being on the face of the earth. During times of war, the forces of violence and death have great power, the power to take up residence inside every one of us, to harden our hearts toward our neighbors, to harden our hearts toward death and pain and suffering. And the forces of violence and death can wreak havoc on all of us, making us feel like we're all in that catch-22 situation where we must choose sides in a conflict, that we must judge who's right and who's wrong, or sanctify one group's violence while condemning the other, or dehumanize and demonize our enemies and glorify our allies, or worse, to try and decide that some must die so other people can live in safety. War anywhere in our world is a war for our hearts and souls. So we must be on guard, lest the forces of violence and death overtake us and we lose ourselves and our humanity in this time. In times of war, we must give rise in ourselves to that compassion, helping all living beings abandon the will to fight, because that is what it means to be people of love and peace in times of violence and death. The Pharisees tried to get Jesus to choose between endorsing Roman violence against his own people or endorsing violent uprising against the Roman Empire. But Jesus chose peace instead. Many would-be revolutionaries had come before Jesus from some backwater region of Galilee and not only refused to pay the tribute, but summoned their followers to take up arms against their Roman oppressors. The Pharisees and Herodians hoped that Jesus would follow that path, fall into the same trap. But Jesus cunningly maneuvered around the trap that they had set for him and laid one of his own for them. Aware of their malice, Matthew says, Jesus said, "Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin you use for the tribute." And he tricked them into showing their hand. The very fact the Pharisees were able to produce the coin with Caesar's image meant they were carrying one around, which betrayed their loyalties. And then he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" And they answered, "Caesar's," betraying the first two laws of the commandments. And then Jesus said, "Give therefore to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." Every Jew in the first century would have understood that everything belongs to God and nothing belongs to Caesar. Therefore, while Jesus did not explicitly refuse the payment of the tribute, in this cagey reply, he made it clear that the Israelites did not owe anything to Caesar. But he also refused to participate in a violent insurrection. One of the many reasons we struggled this week to know how to feel, the way I struggled to know how to feel, how to think, what to say in the wake of violence in Israel and Gaza, is because we think we owe something to Caesar. The war in the Middle East has nothing to do with the true faith at the heart of Islam, Judaism, or Christianity, but it has everything to do with the religion of empire. Every religious tradition has peace and love for all humanity at its core, yet any religious tradition that intertwines itself with the project of empire becomes toxic, violent, and deadly. So as Christians in America, we don't get to stand back and say that that's somebody else's problem. Oh, those poor Israelis. Oh, those poor Palestinians. We have to do our history lesson. Take responsibility for the fact that our own version of empire religion, imperial Christianity, is part of what created this mess to begin with in the first place. We don't know, we don't remember that Jews found safe harbor only in Muslim nations until we marched in and killed them both in the Crusades. It was the anti-Semitism from our imperial religion that made the world a violent place for Jews and required the need for a special homeland. We did that. That was our religion. It was Western imperialism that made a mess of the Middle East to begin with, that carved up nations and tribes into regions that we wanted based on what Britain wanted and what France wanted and what America wanted. And America is the nation. Look at the history. We are the nation that has stamped out every potential movement for democracy in the Arab-speaking world to protect our access to oil and money and power. Don't give me this crap about how we care about what's going on over there. Before we cast aspersions on the Israeli government and their violence, or Hamas and their violence, first, we should have looked closely at ourselves and taken responsibility for what we have done and who we've become in the name of imperial Christianity. We are the new Roman Empire. And therefore, Jesus looks at us, at the American church today, and says, "You hypocrites, Stop giving to Caesar your hearts and minds and bodies and souls. Give to America what is America, and give to God what is God's. How do we know if we belong to Caesar? If we're owned by Caesar? If we're possessed by Caesar? How do we know if we're Caesars with an apostrophe S? If we side only with Israel and not with the Palestinians, then we are still Caesars. If we side only with Palestinians and not with Israel, we're still Caesars. If we side only with Jews and not with Muslims, then we're still Caesars. If we side only with Muslims and not with Jews, then we're still Caesars. If we side with America and its interest in the world and not with all other nations and people longing to be free, then we're still Caesars. If we're not condemning all forms of violence and working for peace in the world, then we're still Caesars. If we're not rejecting every attempt to make us choose sides with one kind of violence, then we're still Caesars. If we can't keep from conflating religions with empires, then we're still Caesars. If we can't distinguish Judaism from Israel and Islam from Hamas or Christianity from America, then we're still trapped in the religion of empire and we still belong to Caesar. I don't know about you, but I don't want to belong to Caesar anymore. I don't want to belong to Caesar. I don't want to be owned by Caesar. I don't want to be Caesar's possession and Caesar's property anymore. I've given enough of my life to Caesar up to this point. We belong to God, not to Caesar. And if we belong to God, then we have to give to God what is God's, and that means we give all of ourselves. Created in God's image, we give our heart and mind and body and soul, all of us, and that means there will be nothing left for Caesar. The forces of violence and death, Caesar and all of his 21st century friends are trying everything they can to gain power over us, but we don't have to let them in. We don't have to succumb to false choices and zero-sum games of our culture. We can be people who allow the Prince of Peace, who follow the Prince of Peace, the one who came preaching peace, the one who wept over Jerusalem saying, "Oh, Jerusalem, if only you knew the things that make for peace." The question is, who will we be in a time of war? Who will we be when the world is raging? Will we practice the religion of empire or the religion of Jesus? Will we be Caesars or will we be gods? Will we be overcome by the forces of violence and death that wage war for our hearts and minds and souls and bodies, or will we be people of love and justice and peace? Let us all in this time make a solemn vow that in a time of war we will not lose ourselves. We will not lose our humanity. We will not succumb to the forces of violence and death. Instead, we will give rise in ourselves to the mind of compassion and do whatever is in our power to help all living beings abandon the will to fight. Let us pledge that in this time of war, we will not be Caesars, but we will be people who belong to the God of peace. Amen.